Well, it's a very, very long story related to a love affair, so I will make short on that. Let's say the Mukden incident, meaning that some soldiers of the Quantum Army bombs a part of the railroad north of the town of Mukden, may have been expected, but the spread of this crisis was not. And typically, the government in Japan and also the army ministry were trying to restrain the Quantum Army, saying, well, stop, do not expand your area of operation. But they failed to do so. So it was something, an exogenous shock in the sense that actually this was an event that the government in Tokyo didn't have control over, didn't provoke, didn't have control over, and then completely changed the regional environment from the point of view of Tokyo. Well, the threat perception of Poland has deteriorated, right, because of the war in Ukraine. And therefore, as expected in my argument and what happened in Japan, the military establishment is gaining influence, or at least more space to actually be vocal and saying, well, look, as the Polish army, we need that and that and that to face these kind of threats. Again, this is completely their role, as you said. This is my argument. The military is here to protect a country, and therefore will see threats, even sometimes where there is none, right? Also, the military has this incentive, or let's say this instinct, to try to maximize military power, therefore leading to overbalancing when this policy bias, as I call it, is absorbed by the government. So now to answer directly your question, what I guess Polish people and academics like you should pay attention to is that this greater voice by the Polish military in, I would say, the public space in Poland is normal, but it should not actually suffocate other voices. In other words, the biggest threat is when the military perception starts to, I will say, not gaining a monopoly in the narrative, but starts to be too influential.
What happened? Is the anomaly just longer, or maybe your argument, well, was flawed in a way?
Yeah, well, no, I will take the first option, of course. I will defend my argument. But no,
Dear all, welcome to my channel. Today, I have a great pleasure and an honor to talk with Lionel Fatton, European realist and an expert on Far East policy of Far East states. Today, we will talk about his book about the Japan's rush to the Pacific War. Welcome, Lionel. It's a great pleasure to have you today.
Thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
So the first question I wanted to ask you is, of course, why have you picked? Why the Imperial Japan in the interwar period piqued your interest? Yeah, you live and you work in Switzerland, right? So that's a quite far of a trip. So why Imperial Japan, and also the navalism plays a certain role in your book? Yeah, the armaments in the sea. So why all that? That's super interesting.
Well, it's a very, very long story related to a love affair, so I will make short on that. But basically, I did my second MA degree in Japan at Waseda University in Tokyo. And over there, when I was writing my MA thesis on the attack on Pearl Harbor, and I used at that time for the short story the concept of preventive war to explain why Japan attacked the United States in December of 41. And I mean, I was pretty satisfied with MA thesis, but I got a good grade. And basically, I was showing in the MA thesis that at some point, the Japan basically had the choice between a slow death by suffocation. It was under oil embargo by the Netherlands, the UK, and the US at that time, or the gamble, right, to have this preventive attack on Pearl Harbor and basically to try to push the Americans to raise the right flag. But then, in retrospective, looking back on my MA thesis, I said, well, I understand why the Japanese attacked in December 41. But what I didn't understand is how come this country came to the point where it had this binary choice between being under an oil embargo, and attacking. In other words, slow death by suffocation or the gamble. And therefore, I decided to look back in history to see the path, if you want, this country has taken to reach this crucial point in 1941 that basically pushed the country to attack. And therefore, I ended up studying the 1920s and then the early 1930s. And this is how the idea came out of this book on Japan's rush to the Pacific War, in which I studied if you want, how the military establishment in Japan has managed to somehow slowly impact the foreign policy of the country more and more deeply, to impose its own views on international dynamics, its own choices in terms of foreign policy, and how it ended up to Japan's rush to the Pacific War.
Well, because it is pretty long process. Yeah, like I remember at some point one of my friends writing about Japan from perspective of English school,
Mm,
talking about the socialization to the norms of
mm,
great power politics of late 19th and early 20th century. And he
mm,
was saying basically that Japanese uh, over socialize to power politics in a sense. Yeah, it
mhm,
wanted to be so good that it was in a sense too good in the power politics, which created this drive towards Pearl Harbor, let's say, because it has
mhm,
this symbolical meaning. Well, let's go to your book a little more in the detail. So generally, you're creating a model um, to explain this drive towards Pearl Harbor. And in your model, yeah, there is this external shock of Western powers that react to Manchurian incidents that constitutes this external shock that in a sense enables military elites of Japanese empire to securitize the international environment of Japan, so it
mhm,
actually appears, yeah, before the audience, so the elite that is conducting foreign policy, yeah, as very hostile, dangerous, and unpermissive, yeah. And this securitization is what enabled the military to gain what you might call, I don't know, undue influence upon the
mhm,
Japanese political system. Yeah, and this militarization is what led to the central category of your book, overbalancing. Yeah, so going too hard to get your security, because it was like, and this fact of overbalancing created this well-known positive feedback loop that we call a security dilemma between the Japan and the US. But there are a couple of problems I see with such a framing of this historical process. First question that comes to mind: why just not imperialism, overextension, or revisionism? Yeah,
mhm,
those are the labels that are very often used to describe imperial Japan in the interwar period. So why did you choose overbalancing as your like key theoretical vehicle to explain what happened?
mhm. There are two reasons to that. The first one is that Jack Snyder has written a book, Myth of Empire, which covers actually overexpansion, um, and was extremely convincing. So I didn't want to actually either challenge this book, because this is from one of my Bibles, I will say. And I thought it was so convincing that actually my added value will be limited. And the second reason is maybe more important, is that the overbalancing, in other words, the tendency of a country to build too strong military power when it comes to the security threat it is facing, is a concept that is under conceptualized in the higher literature. So of course, balancing, right, in the realist school is something that is extremely important as a state behavior. Balancing has been discussed from Morgenthau to Waltz to Kenneth Stephen Walton, etc. Underbalancing has been pretty much discussed, especially in the neoclassical realist literature. But overbalancing, I mean, I was looking at the literature and I said, well, very, very few discussion, in-depth discussion. So I thought it was interesting. And also, I wanted to have an analysis of the case study before, I will say, the imperialist turn of Japan. In other words, the 1920s and the really early 1930s. In other words, some will argue, yes, the imperialist push for Japan started, with Formosa in 1895, right? The Shimonoseki Treaty. But somehow it's, well, as you say, socialization. Japan was playing by the game of the great power rules and etc., etc. But I mean, imperialism in the Japanese foreign policy, and I agree with Jack Snyder in this regard, really starts in 1937. Um, uh, and I wanted to look before, because I think the critical juncture in the Japanese imperialist terms happens before 1937. And therefore, that's why I looked at what happened in the early 1930s, and the concept that fit the best, actually, the behavior of Japan during this period was overbalancing rather than overexpansion or imperialism. So I decided to really focus on that. So there is this, I will say, added value in terms of conceptualization, because overbalancing was not that well conceptualized. And also maybe a period of the Japanese, I will say, imperial history that was not as covered as the second half of the 30s and of course the first half of the 1940s.
Well, honestly, and that's like a huge uh, question mark that appeared in my head
Mm-hmm.
because there is a book by Jeffrey Taliaferro, I think,
Mm.
about the intervention in periphery. And
Yes.
one of the case studies that he uses is actually the same time period that you're covering in the book. But for
Yes.
whatever reason, you pay very scant attention to Taliaferro's book. Yeah, I know he's using this very, well, in a sense, positivistic way of doing his research design. Yeah, he's using this theory from social psychology, yeah, the prospect theory to explain the situation. But I was wondering because in a sense, your book, I view your book as a neoclassical, well, more classical response to the research problem
Mm.
than Taliaferro did. Yeah, although he is one of the neoclassical realists, one of the triplets, as I call them,
Mm-hmm.
Taliaferro, Lobel, and Norin Ripsman. Yeah, yeah. I call them the triplets of neoclassical realism because but they actually wrote a lot of interesting stuff on their own. Really, like they
Mm-hmm.
are much better scholars when they are working solo than when they are working in conjunction. Anyway, so for me, your book, in a sense, is a polemics with the Taliaferro's take on the subject matter, and I was really curious why you didn't like put it to the fore. Yeah, that you are arguing with take.
Yeah, what I mean, we are not, we are talking about the same context, the same countries, the same actors, but we are not talking about the same thing. That's the point. He is talking about the intervention in the Japanese periphery, right?
Hmm.
For me, this intervention and the Montreal crisis or the Shanghai crisis and etc. are more contextual factors. I'm digging more into domestic politics in Tokyo.
Hmm. Okay.
And this is in other words, if you want, I'm looking at how I would say, systemic evolution, systemic factors, so the Montreal crisis, for example, impacted the domestic politics in Tokyo, which led to actually a foreign policy that was more and more overbalancing against the United States. So I'm more, if you want, you may know that there is Panos Vassiliadis published an article earlier this year, I think, yes, on what he calls transitive neoclassical realism. which is all about trying to unveil patterns in the foreign policy of countries, rather than looking at foreign policy choices, right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
In which you have systemic incentives provoking causal mechanism at the domestic level, which which result in patterns of foreign policy. And this is what I was studying. And I was focusing primarily on the domestic dynamics. And that's why, again, I talk, of course, about the Manchurian crisis, but I'm rather using the Manchurian crisis and to understand how this crisis impacted the position of the different domestic entities in Japan that had a say on the formulation of foreign policy, and how these different domestic entities interacted with each other, trying to advance their vested interest, usually institutional, and therefore through this dynamism, this I would say what I call institutional struggle between different entities, this actually biased the foreign policy of Japan.
Well, I do like this struggle between different organizational structures within the same state as something that, we as looking out like on this state from outside see as the driving motive of its foreign policy.
Mhm.
In a sense, I would say it melds well with very like the older pieces from neoclassical realism, like what Zakaria wrote. Yeah, that
Mhm.
like the states started on this imperialist venture only when they have the institutions to back the drive up, or
Mhm.
in a sense,
Mhm.
the institutions themselves were what created the drive itself.
Yes,
And
from wealth to power,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And and this is very sensible, honestly. Yeah, because we can imagine two bureaus don't liking one another, joking
Mhm.
for position, joking for the ear of decision makers, yeah, joking for funds, yeah, and because of this internal bureaucratic, in a sense, conflict,
Mhm.
there is this drive that materialize itself as an outward foreign policy of a state. And if I remember correctly, in foreign policy analysis studies, there is actually like a model of bureaucratic politics
Mhm.
that is describing a certain patterns, of course, of the U.S. Foreign policy decision making. Yeah? That the
Mhm.
conflicts in bureaucracy are the key factor to understand or to explain why the certain decisions have been made. Okay, so the systemic shock, as I see it, yes, it I would say in your book it's like an important linkage to more general, systemic structural realist lore or theory. Yeah, so you use it to link it to this literature, but for me the intuition when I hear the word shock is that it's something unexpected,
Mhm.
something that happens suddenly. um, the, was there really no consciousness in the Japanese army circles about like bigger possible systemic impact of their adventurism? Yeah, like
Mhm.
did Japanese policymakers really make this Pikachu face? Yeah,
Mhm. Mhm.
they didn't like that we attacked Manchuria. Yeah, well, figures, right?
Yeah.
Um, so is this shock something that quote unquote really happened, or, and I think this is argument in your book. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
Mhm.
was it um, constructed by certain parts of Japanese military as actually a shock? Yeah. What would be
Okay.
the
Yes, yes. So when I'm talking about exogenous shocks, these are events that are unpredictable. Uh, in other words, unpredictable. It can be predictable, but something that is out of control of the foreign policy executive, right? So this is also important to define the actors I'm talking about. So the foreign policy executives, well, as you know, in neoclassical realist parlance, it's all about basically let's say, the decision makers and at the national level and their advisors, right? So the Montreal crisis, the beginning was the Mukden incident, right, in September 31, This one was unexpected. So of course, the government in Tokyo knew that the Kwantung Army, which had the control over basically the South Manchurian railroad infrastructures and had a pretty substantial force already based in Manchuria, was a restive military force. So it was difficult to control even by the army ministry in Tokyo. But it was unexpected in the sense that actually the Mukden incident rapidly spilled over into a, let's say, full-fledged invasion of Manchuria. And in the book, I work on archives, right, that I collected in Tokyo during research. And the government was taken by surprise by actually the spread of this conflict. So let's say the Mukden incident, meaning that some soldiers of the Kwantung Army bombs a part of the railroad north of the town of Mukden, may have been expected, but the spread of this crisis was not. And typically, the government in Japan and also the army ministry were trying to restrain the Kwantung Army, saying, "Well, stop! Do not expand your area of operation." But they failed to do so. So it was something, an exogenous shock in the sense that actually this was an event that the government in Tokyo didn't have control over, didn't provoke, didn't have control over, and then completely changed the regional environment from the point of view of Tokyo. In other words, there is something new in the regional environment. And that's why the exogenous shock in my argument is important, because something changes and something that can, at the end of the day, impact the national security. And therefore, what the government should do at that time is try to gather a new group of advisors, institutions, intelligence services, and etc., to try to understand what's happening now, right? Because one of my key arguments in this book is to say, well, a government is basically blind. Why? Because a government has a lot of things to do. Why? It has to deal with socio-economic issues, with financial issues, with elections if there are, and it perceives the world through organizational sensors. And when you have something unfolding extremely rapidly in the periphery, for example, like in Manchuria, you have, as a government leader, to absorb information, to understand what's happening on the ground. What do? You actually gather people from, again, the Navy Ministry, the Army Ministry, the Finance Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, and tell them, well, what's happening now? What is at stake here? And how can we respond to this situation? And this is here that the institutional dynamic starts, if you want. This is here that some institution will try to say, well, to impose their own view of the reality to the government, saying, well, let's say the army ministry will say, well, the Chinese attacked us. So you, Tokyo, have to provide more soldiers to the Kwantung Army because the Chinese provoked us, so we had to react. The Navy having another point of view, the Foreign Ministry having another point of view, and etc. And here, if you want, you have this discussion that is contained in my book about how these different perceptions, institutional perceptions, will clash with each other, right? And here, if you want, this is what I call the politicization of the formulation of threat perception. Because then all the different institutions will try to impose their own worldviews or views on the regional environment to try to advance their vested interest, right?
Okay, so basically, if we understand that, like, the decision making center need to see, so putting something in their eyes gives us the advantage over what the decision will be. It's definitely like the members of those bureaucracies or interest groups understand it as well, even probably better than we do. Yeah, so they maybe not try to precisely explain what is the matter, yeah, but that's a part of, I guess, internal politics within governments, right?
Yeah.
who has the ear of the decision maker, or in your instance, an eye. So we talked about how the balancing category is one of the staples of realist theorizing, yeah, and in a sense your book is your own take on balancing, yeah,
Mhm.
and I think it's important because it creates like the whole spectrum within the category. Yeah, we have too little balancing, we have the balancing, yeah, and now you are working uh, to make overbalancing understandable, yeah, as a phenomena that actually happens and had a certain impact on international politics. So I have a question, which is of course relevant for me, and so as you describe the phenomena, would you say that overbalancing is the case for Putin's foreign policy, especially since like 2008, maybe 2014? Is it a case of overbalancing, or in your opinion, or from the perspective of your own uh, theoretical and realist thinking, it's something else than the over balancing? Because I don't know if you can make an argument yet that the Japanese were overbalancing and it was their folly of their perception, yeah.
Mhm.
I guess you can make similar argument towards Putin's policy for Russia. Yeah, but then again, I'm really looking forward for your view on the matter.
Um, I think I will not qualify the Russian policy, foreign policy, and I would say, yeah, geostrategic posture since, let's say, 2008 as overbalancing, because in the book I talk about overbalancing in the sense that when a country develops an inflated threat perception, it will have a tendency to usually to have a military buildup that goes too high compared to the threat to its national security, right? So Japan going out of the Washington system, basically starting an unfettered naval expansion that will absorb at some point 30% of the GDP, and et cetera, with the US reacting, and as you say, the security dilemma. Uh, I don't see the Russian policy over the past decade or so as overbalancing necessarily. Uh, Now, whether it's an instance of overexpansion, possibly. But in the book, I make the difference. I conceptualize the difference between overbalancing and overexpansion. Overbalancing is really I will say, an inappropriate response to a threat to national security, right? Overexpansion is when you start to expand outside your territory. Usually, countries start expanding outside because they perceive an opportunity to do so, or sometimes they misperceive an opportunity to do so. In other words, they may perceive a power vacuum that doesn't exist, for example,
Mhm.
right? Or they think they have an advantage in terms of the balance of military power that can help them achieve their objective through the use of armed forces. This is conceptually different from overbalancing. So typically regarding the war in Ukraine, I think misperception was a factor in the decision to attack in Moscow. But I guess it was a misperception of the balance of power, or the ability of the Ukrainians to resist somehow. And therefore, it's more here something that will fall theoretically in line with the concept of overexpansion. Um, and therefore, I will not put it in the same basket as the argument of my book.
Mhm.
But for sure, there are some parallels between the two concepts, overbalancing and overexpansion, and therefore I put them actually in one macro concept, which I call
Okay.
systemic overreacting.
Mhm.
And both of them are actually problematic behaviors because they are counterproductive at the end of the day, and we see that today with the war in Russia, in Ukraine, which I think at the systemic level again is counterproductive for Russia. Um, and both these systemic overreactings actually take their roots in a problem of perception. And here I think there was a problem of perception in Moscow over the past few years. One again is the inability to say that actually, winning a sharp and short war will be much more complicated than what was thought. The second was also certainly a misperception of the ability of Europe to unite, and let's say the West to unite in terms of sanctions, for example, right? I think there was, in the wake of Brexit, in the wake of the movement in Catalonia, in Spain, and etc., I think there was a perception in Moscow that actually Europe will remain divided, etc. So two big misperceptions here that actually led maybe to a risk acceptant behavior by Moscow that was not actually grounded in objective facts. And therefore, it was a mistake. It's a systemic mistake. Like overbalancing for the Japanese in the 30s, I think it was a systemic mistake. Because honestly, if you look at the national interest of Russia, they were much better protected before February 2022 than now, right?
They have those frozen conflicts. They have the NATO and EU states really not letting Ukraine in. Like that just wouldn't happen. Yeah, like a lot of policymakers and analysts in Poland before 22. Yeah, they were absolutely like, we felt this. How do you say it? Like the feeling of doom that you can do nothing to push the Ukraine's membership in NATO or EU. That is done deal. Like the Russian strategy actually worked. They created this frozen conflict. There is no way the Ukraine gonna be part of EU or NATO. Yeah, which is in Poland's national security interest, right? So before 22, we had this feeling like the Russian outplay us basically. So that's to use gamer language, that's a GG. Yeah, that's all she wrote, right? But then after 22, yeah, it actually it came back on the table. Yeah, you have guys like Kotkin, yeah, for example, very smart guy that I really cannot recommend to listen to his lectures enough. And he's saying, okay, maybe not a NATO membership, but strong security guarantees. Yeah, and for sure the EU membership is the theory of victory for Ukraine. Yeah, that's something they should strive as a result of their armed struggle against the Russians. Yeah, and those are things that here in Poland we were not there to hope before Putin started his invasion. So
yeah, and then if you take into account, I mean, in terms of the geostrategy of Russia, if you take into account the fact that Sweden, Finland have joined NATO, I have heard the argument that some people say, well, look, the war in Ukraine has been problematic for Russia in many regards, but at least there is a positive point, is that Russia has been able to get closer to China, to North Korea. I mean, is it a gift or a curse? I mean, the only thing I see, but being an East Asian specialist, the only thing I see is that Russia is just the relationship between Russia and China is just much more asymmetrical than before. I'm very not convinced that this is in the interest of Moscow in the long run, right?
But you can make a very interesting argument that this isn't necessarily in the interest of Peking as well, because then they need to take responsibility for their junior partner, even if the junior partner does pretty reckless things, let's say it like that. Yeah, so it's actually a two-way street. That's a very interesting argument that I overlooked for quite some time. Yeah, that in a sense, yeah, it's not necessarily in Chinese interest to give the Russians the carte blanche. Yeah,
no, true. Yeah. And that's why China, from my point of view, is extremely reluctant to openly back Russia. And that's why I think, well, we divert a bit from the book, but it's interesting. And that's why I think that China has been, has been eager somehow to let Russia and North Korea having a much deeper relationship in terms of, military supplies and etc. Because China doesn't like usually, Russia to meddle in North Korean issues because
Is they see it as their own sphere of
that's
influence, yeah,
that,
not something where the Russians should
that's
put
the
their
point.
hands into. Yeah.
Yeah, but now because the Chinese understand that Russia needs actually military supplies from third countries to continue its war effort in Ukraine, but doesn't want actually to be under the spotlight by itself providing military assets to Russia. Well, okay, so you can reach out to North Korea and we won't say anything. That's interesting, right?
In a sense, it also shows that the global hegemon, however waning, still have a lot of agency. Yeah, because that's a red line drawn by the USA, right? Don't
Mhm.
send weapons to Russia or there will be consequences. Yeah, that's very openly said by the Washington to Beijing, right?
Yeah, and
And
yeah, and I think to add to that, I think what the United States did extremely well during this war, and even before February 2022, was to galvanize allies, because the United States certainly is the strongest military power today, still the strongest economy. But the strength of this country on the international scene lies mostly on its alliance networks and on the dollar,
mhm.
the currency, right? And it has been able to galvanize the allies to an extent that few people imagined before February 2022, being Europe or Asian allies and etc. It's impressive.
Okay, before we go too far and praise USA for their foreign policy too much, that's a very counterintuitive. Yeah, nobody will believe us. uh, let's go to the question that is very relevant from my perspective, my own like national perspective, if you may. So the large part of your explanation for this overbalancing was this military state of mind, if you will.
Mm,
Yeah, that the soldiers will do soldier things because that's their vocation, that's their calling. Yeah, it's hard to blame them for looking for threats everywhere because that's what they do. Yeah, that's
mhm,
that's their ethos. And that's I very much like this argument because it's very sensible for me to look it like that. Yeah, it's not like this reckless willy-nilly, oh, let's go
mhm,
and just conquer everyone. It's more about like, yeah, we are tasked to bring security, so we look for threats. That's I really like this part of your explanation a lot, also because it shows the danger of it. Yeah, that even though you may say that the ethos and the motives are good in a sense, yeah, they can bring for on the systemic level very dangerous consequences, right?
mm,
And in Poland, we have this huge boost in military spending. We are forming five to six divisions. We have those territorial forces, like all the military industrial complex is booming. Yeah, as far as it actually booms. Yeah, the more stuff is being built, the more stuff is being procured, the amount of soldiers that we have is expanding. Yeah, and
mhm,
and I was talking with two very smart guys from Polish Naval Academy, and they were saying, look, Mateusz, like, yeah, we are preparing to deter, hopefully, or worst case scenario, to defend against Russian invasion. Yeah, that's what we want to do. And you need to expect bigger voice of the military people in Polish public affairs because it's only natural. Yeah, but then again, what would be your, I guess, advice, or what would be the wisdom you gleaned from the Japanese example? Yeah, how to properly manage this bigger and bigger appearance of military men and military or women, military person, I guess, military person appearance in Polish discourse, yeah, in Polish social life. How to manage it? Like, should you look for institutional solutions, or maybe you should look for like the culture, right? And like soldier ethos from a particular country can guard against the folly of
Mm.
too much of militarism. What would be your take? Like, as a Polish guy, what should I look for and be on guard against in this context?
Very good question. In my book, uh, from my point of view, one of my biggest added value is that I merge the literature on threat perception and the literature on civil-military relations. This is something that has been barely done, especially in the neoclassical realist context. What your question relates to civil-military relations. The point is, as you say, well, there is a threat. Well, the threat perception of Poland has deteriorated, right, because of the war in Ukraine. And therefore, as expected in my argument and what happened in Japan, the military establishment is gaining influence, or at least more space to actually be vocal and saying, well, look, as the Polish army, we need that and that and that to face these kind of threats. Again, this is completely their role, as you said. This is my argument. The military is here to protect a country, and therefore will see threats, even sometimes where there is none, right? Also, the military has this incentive, or let's say this instinct, to try to maximize military power, therefore leading to overbalancing when this policy bias, as I call it, is absorbed by the government. So now to answer directly your question, what I guess Polish people and academics like you should pay attention to is that this greater voice by the Polish military in, I would say, the public space in Poland is normal, but it should not actually suffocate other voices. In other words, the biggest threat is when the military perception starts to, I will say, not gaining a monopoly in the narrative, but starts to be too influential. And the problem is here, if you want, a sclerosis of the debate on how we perceive the world and the regional dynamics, and what do we do about it. And therefore, the objective will be to find a balance. So yes, the military voice will become louder in Poland, that's for sure, right? But the voices, for example, of the diplomats is at least as important as the voice of the military. And there should be a balance between the two. Because yes, security is important, or let's say hard security, but hard security is not sufficient, right? You need to actually have a nuanced approach to everything. And especially when you face a country like Russia, which Russia has made, I think, this mistake, uh, has made the mistake of listening, of being too military minded somehow. And therefore, the I will say the use of armed forces in the Russian foreign policy since the Georgia story in 2008 is obviously one of the main tools used by Russia to advance, right? Its foreign policy objectives. So think about Libya, think about Syria, and you see another use, if you want, of the armed forces in Russia over the past decade or so. That's dangerous. That's dangerous because the world cannot be modified or meddled with only through military tools. So you need also diplomacy. And this is the same for Poland. So typically, it's very important for Poland, from my point of view today, to reinforce its deterrence posture. But you have to be extra careful not to be too provocative in doing so, because remember that Russia today perceives the world through the military eye, and therefore will tend to exaggerate the threats, and therefore may lead to other reactions when it comes to the Poland military buildup, right?
Well,
And therefore,
honestly,
you need, you know what I mean? Protect yourself. Make sure not to be overtly provocative. Always keep channels of communications and diplomatic outreach open, being with friends or enemies, and therefore have a balanced approach to your security environment.
well, that's something the Polish national character. I still like to talk about national characters. I really do. But this is something that Polish national character struggles with. So, like if we have enemies, we have enemies. Yeah. And if the Russian is our traditional other, it is our traditional other.
Yes.
And this is a part of our ontological security. Thinking about Russians as a source of danger is a part of our strategic culture. So you have a very strong structuring structures in our I guess intersubjective field of what makes us Polish nation, yeah, and that's super dangerous, because I absolutely agree with you, yeah, that even if you don't like Russians, you need to be ready to talk with them, yeah, and there is, but on the other hand, there are optimistic accents, I guess, when the Russian, when the interceptor from S-300 and air defense system dropped in Przewozów in Poland, killing two Polish farmers. The internet instantly flared with short meme videos about Poland using Article 5 and starting the nuclear war. It's obviously Russian propaganda. Absolutely, very, like, if you have some knowledge about how the propaganda work in new media, it was obvious that this is like concentrated Russian effort to paint Poland as a very, gun-ho country that just want to start something and all that. Our government, that I really never bothered to praise too much at the time, yeah, actually acted very, very well. They were cool, calm, and collected. They started with the Article 4, they started with the consultations. They say, okay, let's see what happened, like where it came from, and all that. So even though like I said, from my Polish perspective, our politics is very polarized, and it's getting worse and worse. Still, sometimes, like, the institutions work as intended, and political class is not suicidal. So that's I guess an optimistic part. Okay, Lionel, last part, in the context, still in the context of what happens to the east of European Union. I remember in Potsdam, you had this very interesting and provocative, in my opinion, piece about how this reaction to war is just something transitory, yeah, and then we can expect the Western, the West, basically the institutional West, the liberal rule of law West, yeah, sees, especially in Europe, sees to help Ukraine so much, because like there was initial push to help them because they were in trouble, I guess, but then everybody would like go to business as usual, yeah. Do I remember correctly your the thrust of your argument?
More or less, yes.
So do you think that because the US finally pushed through the Senate this big help package, yeah, the France is talking about sending NATO military personnel into the war. Of course, Macron will say what Macron will say, but nobody takes him too seriously. But still there is a lot of talk about it. There is like more and more Patriot systems being sent, bought by the European money. Yeah, the European Union actually steps up its game as far as their bureaucracy. Yeah, the bureaucrats are saying, yeah, we need to push more material help for Ukraine to fight a war, right? So is the anomaly longer than you expected, and you still expect it to cease in a year time, or do you think that maybe your initial take on the matter was maybe not that accurate?
Sorry.
I'm really
Yeah,
curious, because
yeah.
you really made a very intelligent argument about how, in your opinion, this will stop. It's not stopping, but the argument was nevertheless very persuasive. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why I'm asking what happened. Is the anomaly just longer, or maybe your argument, well, was flawed in a way?
Yeah, well, no, I will take the first option, of course. I will defend my argument. But no, it was not an, I will not say an anomaly, but I was telling about the fact, well, I was focusing, remember, on the Zeitenwende of Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a comparative study with Japan, right, which had its own historical turning point, right, in the national security strategy issued in December 2022. And what I was saying is that these efforts to, I will say, have finally a modern fighting force in Germany, to have finally Japan having power projection capabilities with counter strikes and etc. I was saying that this effort is not sustainable. So I was not talking specifically on the delivery of assistance to Ukraine, even though it's related. I will come back to that. But I was saying about the Bundeswehr, for example, because if you listen to Olaf Scholz on the 27th of February 2022 and the Zeitenwende speech, well, I mean, Germany is coming back as the great power of Europe, right? It's all about the Bundeswehr, the special funds, billions of dollars, and etc. Now, where are we now? Scholz presenting himself as the peace chancellor, going against his own defense minister, saying we will not add anything to the budget. I mean, I was talking to German diplomats recently, and they were telling me, well, Zeitenwende is over since the beginning, and it has never really taken roots. And the special fund voted in the summer 2022 to boost the defense budget will end in 2027. Many people say, well, what's next for the defense budget, right? And therefore, my argument is that the Zeitenwende will not last. Like the Japanese military buildup, will face a lot of domestic difficulties, and it is facing now, because if you look at what's happening in Germany, well, Olaf Scholz now is more focused, of course, on the European elections, but also on immigration, right? So this is now the priority of his agenda is immigration. Is no more Zeitenwende or Bundeswehr. The same in Japan. It's all about inflation and wage growth, right? And therefore, if you want the political momentum that was somehow triggered in, let's say, Berlin and Tokyo after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, this political momentum is losing steam in both countries. And my developed arguments on what I said in Postam is that this will be the case as long as the military umbrella provided by the United States with two countries is as robust as it is.
Okay.
Because these countries have the ability to hide themselves behind a military umbrella that is by far the strongest in the world. And therefore,
Hide
why
or
then
free ride on this umbrella, yeah, like
some
Mary
people will
Poppins.
say, exactly. Now, but regarding the delivery of weapon systems to Ukraine, well, I see also here something that is not that sustainable in the long run. Coming back to Germany, if you look at polls, less and less Germans support sending, heavy weaponry to Ukraine and etc. I mean, the support is declining. In US, yes, big aid package recently by Congress. Well, look at how the aid package was formulated and sold. Well, it was sold especially because it was linked to the aid package to Taiwan and Israel. And therefore, there is something here, right? That we have to take into account. And again, yes, some people could say my argument takes longer to actually be reflected in the reality as I was expecting. On the other hand, I mean, if you look in the midterm, let's wait for 2025 what's happening in the United States,
Yes.
and let's see whether the support to Ukraine continues at that level. I'm very skeptical about that, very skeptical. And to finish with that, coming back to Macron again, this is because of the European elections that he was talking about, sending
But
troops in Ukraine.
now I think he's getting ready to send the French Marines to attack Azerbaijan. Yeah, there is
Yeah,
this beef between, like, in the
yeah,
context of the Caledonia Islands and
yeah.
the nickel thingy. That's pretty insane, honestly.
That's
Oh,
that's a democratic what I call a democratic scapegoating. So you
Okay.
or a soft scapegoating, right? You try to show muscle, but and to divert a bit well, to somehow try to influence the media stream and the media agenda, but it doesn't work that much.
Well, we are living in a really strange times, yeah, like in the context of the Bundeswehr and how it's supposedly the Zeitenwende should reinvigorate it. It did not, and it will be probably as it is or getting slowly worse as it was the last 20 years, right? It's really weird times when I, as a Polish guy, am saying that I'm more concerned about the facts that the German doesn't have tanks, actually working tanks, yeah, than they do, and that's
Yeah.
pretty weird thing to say as a Polish guy, that the Germans don't have weapons,
Yeah.
like, and that's bad. Well, anyway, thank you very much for the thought-provoking conversation. Also, thank you very much for writing an awesome book. I really had a lot of fun reading it, and hopefully your next publication will be as bad as badass as this one, or even better. I'm looking forward to reading what will you write next. And thank you very much for the conversation today.
It was a real pleasure, and thanks again for the conversation and the invitation. And I
Thank
wish
you
you the
very
best.
much.